behind every throne. There are bankers, presidents, generals, and monarchs may command armies. But it's the financiers who command the flow of money that makes those armies move. The 20th century was the age of ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus dictatorship. But beneath those battles, another war was being waged. A quiet, financial war between families who saw nations not as symbols, but as investments. Few people know their names, yet their fingerprints are everywhere. The Rothschilds, who built the world's first multinational banking network. The Morgans, who saved the U.S. economy twice. The Rockefellers, who turned oil into empire. And the Warburgs, who helped design the modern central banking system. They didn't march in parades or win elections. They didn't command from podiums. Their power came from balance sheets, from interest rates, from quiet conversations held behind closed doors in London, New York, and Basel. These were the architects of a new world order, not the conspiratorial kind whispered about in online forums, but a genuine global financial order built to ensure that money flowed upward, debt became permanent, and nations stayed dependent. To understand how the modern world really works, the dollar's dominance, the rise of Wall Street, the endless cycle of debt and war, you have to go back to where it all began. A few families, in a few European cities, building a financial web that would outlast empires and shape the next century. This isn't just history. It's the foundation of everything you see around you today, the economy, the markets, even the concept of national debt. And it all started with men who understood one simple truth. The one who controls credit controls the world. The Rothschild family began in the cramped Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt in the 18th century. Mayer Amschel Rothschild wasn't born into privilege. He was a coin dealer, historian, and strategist. But he understood something revolutionary. Gold was power, but credit was control. By the early 1800s, he had placed each of his 5 sons in a different European capital: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, forming the world's first international banking network. While kings fought wars, the Rothschilds financed both sides, ensuring that whichever flag flew victorious, their interests would survive. They revolutionized state finance through bonds. Before them, governments relied on taxes or plunder. After them, they borrowed, indefinitely. Nations became customers, and war became business. The family's greatest triumph came during the Napoleonic Wars. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, leveraged insider intelligence from battlefront couriers to outmaneuver markets. When Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, Rothschild bought up British bonds when everyone else was selling. And in one stroke, he became the most powerful banker in Europe. By mid-century, the Rothschilds were financing railways, mines, and even the Suez Canal. Monarchs called them the 6th great power of Europe. Yet their genius wasn't in gold, but in trust. Governments knew that if the Rothschilds backed alone, it would succeed. Their influence waned in the 20th century as national central banks rose. But their model lived on: transnational finance, discrete influence, and the quiet belief that control over debt is control over destiny. If the Rothschilds built Europe's financial empire, the Morgans built America's. J.P. Morgan wasn't just a banker. He was a stabilizer of capitalism itself. In an age before the Federal Reserve, when the U.S. economy ran on private credit and trust, Morgan became both. During the Panic of 1907, when markets crashed and banks failed, Morgan locked the nation's top financiers in his library and refused to let them leave until they had agreed to a bailout. His word was law. The crisis ended not because of government intervention, but because one man acted as America's unofficial central bank. But power breeds imitation and fear. In 1913, Congress created the Federal Reserve, modeled partly on Morgan's methods but designed to shift power from private individuals to institutional control. Ironically, it achieved the opposite. It concentrated financial power even further, just in more opaque hands. The Morgans financed railroads, steel, and General Electric. They underwrote wars and stabilized treasuries. Their reach extended from Wall Street to the White House. When J.P. Morgan testified before Congress, a senator asked, Isn't commercial credit based primarily upon money or property?" Morgan smiled and said, "No, sir. The first thing is character. Character, meaning reputation, trust, the invisible foundation of finance. And in that invisible realm, Morgan ruled absolutely. If money was power, oil was its fuel. And no family understood that better than the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller turned crude oil into refined wealth, building Standard Oil into the most powerful corporation in the world by the early 1900s. His genius wasn't just business, it was structure. He created trusts, holding companies, and vertical monopolies that allowed him to dominate an entire industry from the ground up. When the U.S. government broke up Standard Oil in 1911 for violating antitrust laws, Rockefeller didn't lose. His empire simply multiplied. Each baby Standard became a new giant. Exxon, Chevron, Mobil. He became the richest man in history. The Rockefeller Foundation went on to shape medicine, education, and foreign policy. Their wealth funded universities, think tanks, and even global institutions like the United Nations. But their greatest influence came through banking. By mid-century, the Rockefellers' Chase Bank became one of the world's largest financial institutions, bridging politics and commerce across continents. Behind every peace conference, oil deal, or philanthropic program, their influence lingered, quiet, immense, and permanent. The Rockefellers had mastered what every empire builder before them learned. If you control energy, you control industry. If you control finance, you control the future. While the Morgans and Rockefellers ruled America's private capital, another family quietly shaped its monetary future. The Warburgs. Paul Warburg, a German banker educated in European finance, moved to New York in the early 1900s and was appalled by how chaotic American banking was. He pushed for a central bank that could stabilize credit, control money supply, and prevent panics. In 1910, at a secret meeting on Jekyll Island, Warburg and a handful of financiers drafted what would become the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. Officially, it was sold as reform. In practice, it transferred the power of money creation from Congress to a semi-private institution controlled by bankers. Through the 20th century, central banks became the ultimate instruments of control, not by overt coercion, but by subtle manipulation of interest rates, liquidity, and debt. The Warburg vision had triumphed. Money was no longer wealth. It was a policy tool. By mid-century, the heirs of these dynasties weren't just bankers, they were global policymakers. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the IMF, the BIS, all were shaped by men whose fortunes came from private empires of credit. These institutions didn't conquer with armies. They conquered through debt diplomacy, structural loans, and global monetary standards. Nations no longer needed to be invaded to be controlled. They just needed to borrow. In a world built on leverage, the bankers of the 19th century had given birth to a new form of empire, one managed not by emperors, but by economists. By the end of the 20th century, the world the Rothschilds, Morgans, Rockefellers, and Warburgs built had matured. Their names faded from headlines, replaced by institutions, IMF, ECB, World Bank, Goldman Sachs, but their logic endured. They had proven that control over money was control over civilization itself. Wars could be financed, crises could be engineered, markets could be saved or destroyed with a meeting and a pen stroke. Their power wasn't in corruption or conspiracy, but in continuity. Each generation refined the machinery of debt and credit until the system itself became self-sustaining, a perpetual motion engine of dependency. Most people today think of banks as neutral utilities. Few realize that the architecture of modern finance was built by a handful of men who saw the world as a balance sheet. The world didn't need kings anymore. It had creditors. And though the names have changed, the game has not. Every government, every corporation, every citizen still plays on a board they designed, where the rules were written not in parliaments, but in private ledgers. Their empire was invisible, but its walls surround us still. If this gave you a new perspective, click subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.